Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this special event we have today with a very good friend of ours and a colleague of mine for many, many years, Ambassador Frank Wisner, who I believe is well known to most of you here. I'm not allowed to introduce Frank, and I'm going to have Charles Foster do the honors, because Frank and I know so much about one another that we made a pledge that we will never introduce each other with the risk of doing some personal indiscretions that will get out into the press. So basically, I would like to thank the Asia Society. We have done several things in the past and want to recognize Nancy Hawes here of the Asia Society, and we hope to have more programs jointly with the Asia Society here at the Baker Institute and with them at the Asia Society in Houston, doing very good work. The subject, of course, new priorities in South Asia, U.S. policy toward India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, a very important and very timely topic, as you can tell from reading the newspapers and looking at the television news. It's urgent, and there's no one better than Frank who can give us some very special insights into this. So with no further ado, I'd like to call on Charles Foster, another good friend, to come up and do the honors.
Thank you, Ed. On behalf of the Asia Society, we're delighted, of course, to do anything with the Baker Institute. And the Baker Institute has made such a tremendous contribution to the city of Houston, and I know, as Frank knows, this is a very prestigious forum when you speak at the Baker Institute, and and a lot of that's attributable, most of it's attributable to Ed Jurizian. We're glad we have a room full of former ambassadors, one of which is our former chairman of the Asia Society, Roy Huffington. Roy, you're supposed to be sitting right there. You didn't sit where you were supposed to. Yeah. And the Consul General of India would be here, but he is in India. But we're delighted our friend and his wife Kusum is here with us. So thank you for joining us. So it's my pleasure, as Ed said, to introduce a man that needs no introduction to either the Baker Institute or the Asia Society, Ambassador Frank Wisner, who is now the Vice President of External Affairs with AIG. Most importantly, he served until 1990 for about 4 or 5 years as U.S. Ambassador to India. He held a number of important positions, but the most important for today's topic is having served as U.S. Ambassador to India. Please welcome Ambassador Frank Wisner.
Well, as I look around the room, I have many words of thanks. First of all, and principally, it's a terrific pleasure to be back at the Baker Institute again. I had the pleasure on my return to the United States from India several years ago at Ed Jurizian's request to be able to come here and to speak on perspectives for India and the United States in the time ahead. I didn't realize I would be back even as soon as this on the same subject, but such is the pace of events and the importance that I'm delighted to be able to return. I also wanted to thank Nancy, Roy, Foster, you, sir, for the invitation of the Asia Society. I am a terrific admirer of the Asia Society, and I am also very, very pleased with the progress that the Asia Society is making in Houston. I am enormously excited about the undertaking, Roy, thanks to your great vision to build an Asia House in Houston and make this city one of the premier destinations for visitors from and programs about Asia. So if I can add a personal word of good wishes and for what lies ahead in a very important undertaking. Ladies and gentlemen, I come today to thank Ed and Nancy indeed, but also to give you a report on the work that took place over the past 2 years of an independent task force on India and South Asia, which itself is a joint product of the Asia Society and the Council on Foreign Relations. Together with Nicholas Platt, the president of the Asia Society, we worked very hard and published at the latter part of last year, latter part of 2003, the report that I notice a number of you have in your hands. We took the conclusions of that report to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India in early December, and I'll touch briefly on what we concluded as a result of that trip. And finally, I will reflect with you this morning on the rather dramatic developments in prospects for the negotiations that are now underway between two such long estranged nations, India and Pakistan. But first and foremost, we're gathered here today to reflect on a serious subject, the United States and South Asia. This is a subject that has preoccupied many people for some time, and therefore the Council on Foreign Relations during the course of the 90s produced literally 2 reports on the subject, the Asia Society. One, recognizing the growing awareness throughout the 1990s that South Asia was changing in its importance to the United States. The perspectives we and Americans had on that part of the world were changing very rapidly. And South Asia was becoming, as the 1990s advanced, critical to American security and economic interests, to our very well-being. South Asia was therefore, as the last decade in the last century came to an end, no longer a backwater of American policy. And we collectively in New York, between the Council and the Asia Society, concluded that the time was right to bring together scholars, experts from media and academic life, former government officials, to look ahead over the next 5 to 10 years and try to figure out what would be the framework and what would be the judgmental points in charting a course for the United States in South Asia. And we sat down and did precisely that, producing the report that you have in hand. We reflected, of course, on how this decade began with the situation in the region literally at daggers drawn. September 11th revealed to us the depth of the danger the United States faced from Afghanistan, and shortly thereafter, in the fall of that year, we were at war in Afghanistan, where we remain deeply engaged as of today. In the latter part of December 2001, a terrorist attack on the Indian Parliament produced another set of events in South Asia that by the time they settled down, the 2 nuclear-armed nations were on the brink of war. 1 million men mobilized and poised along the frontiers of India and Pakistan. And as we look back at the intelligence and what we know occurred, in June 2002, the pair of nations came perilously close to actually going to war. But South Asia, as this century began, was about much more than simply the dangers the situation imposed on us. We were faced as well by the striking emergence of India as a nation with a global footprint, a capacity to enter the international marketplace and make a huge difference as India moves in the next quarter of a century to becoming the 3rd or 4th largest economy in the world. A strategic objective of the United States as well to change the way we in India had been working, recognizing at the same time the vital importance of Pakistan, a key player in its region, a player with effects not only on the Middle East and Central Asia, a nation with a voice throughout the Muslim world, a place where terror and nuclear proliferation have all come together, whose stability is keenly important to the United States, and to the United States, Pakistan represents one of the toughest foreign policy problems we face as a nation today. And in Afghanistan, I think all of us recognized as well that the conflict there, the end of the Taliban regime, the attempt to install a new successor government that Karzai now heads, we wanted to make certain that in Afghanistan never again would the United States find a nest for terror that would so dramatically strike at American interests. As we sat down over the recent years and looked at last 2 years and looked at the situation, we came to a number of broad conclusions. First and foremost, about India, that the time had come to stabilize the United States' relationship with India, to create a broad and deep engagement politically, economically, and in security matters. President Clinton opened the door, President Bush continued it, but the sustained involvement of those of our cabinet officers in Washington with their counterparts in India is a hallmark of where the United States ought to be, treating India as the great nation, a great nation in the world, enjoying the same degree of intimacy and dialogue that we share with other major powers around the world. We believed as well that the time had come to take a fresh look at our trade and economic policies and intensify a dialogue as India continued on the path towards economic liberalization, aiming for a bold objective, seeing if the United States and India could take advantage of the advent of the information technology age and create a free trade agreement, a free trade regime in services that could be exchanged on both sides. A point I'd underscore for all of you, and particularly in Houston, who are mindful of the growing debate over outsourcing. Here, I believe there is a terrific prospect of continued growth in economic interactions between the United States and India. As American jobs move off this shore, we have to be certain that those jobs are increased for Americans. In short, that India be prepared to open her markets to free trade in financial services, legal services, accounting services, the wide range of service industries in which the United States specializes and in which the Indian market is today closed. And so our dream is to see not only call centers, business process outsourcing, software development taking place in India and strengthening American commerce and industry, but at the same time, India opening her markets to America's strong potential in the balance of the service industries. We saw the need and argued for it, for a relaxation in high technology controls, the very controls that have restrained the United States from developing with India important cooperation in civil nuclear energy, in space cooperation, controls that were born of the long period of estrangement between the United States and India that resulted from American non-proliferation policies. And we believed the time was right and argued in the report that you have in hand that it was time as well for the United States to involve itself, but in a very special way that I will come back to, in the tensions of South Asia, notably over the issue of Kashmir. Well, these dreams for India were matched by an equivalent set of conclusions for Pakistan. With Pakistan, not one of us who examined the situation came to anything but the conclusion that the United States' record of engagement with Pakistan was deeply flawed, that our off and on again relationship, our willingness to cooperate with Pakistan on the one hand, and then to enter into violent disagreements, severing economic ties, foreign assistance ties, political ties, to follow, it produced a record of great instability, a loss of American influence, an inability, therefore, to shape the events that most directly affect American interests as regards to Pakistan. We concluded in the report that you have that the time was right to look at Pakistan in a different way. Whether you agreed or disagreed, liked or didn't like, we needed a steady state of engagement in American policies with Pakistan. We needed at heart to take and seize Musharraf's challenge to his own nation to build a modern, progressive, and dynamic state, and to put the United States on the side of that, without in any manner diminishing the depth of our disagreements, or the red lines, if you will, in our policies towards Pakistan. The difficulties that we face today in securing the border areas with Afghanistan, where Taliban and al-Qaeda elements continue to roam across that border and threaten the stability of the Afghan regime. Our capacity to see al-Qaeda and Taliban sympathizers dealt with or brought to justice in Pakistan, our concerns about terrorism and the institutions that produced it inside Pakistan itself, the extension of terror across the border into India, a fact of 15 years, history between the two countries, the need to bring an end to that, our disagreements with Pakistan as well over nuclear proliferation, a story that in the last weeks each of you will recognize has become a major international focus as the career and behavior of A.Q. Khan and his laboratory and the role of Pakistani governments over the past decades has come to light. But these disagreements notwithstanding, we concluded and understood that there is absolutely no way the United States can protect its interests and advance its interests in South Asia without engaging Pakistan on a steady state basis, and to extend behind a political engagement tangible support in areas important to Pakistan's economic recovery, notably expanding the textile quota entry of Pakistani textile exports into the American market. We came down squarely on the side of the administration's call for a 5-year, $3 billion assistance program for Pakistan, but we argued in the course of our report that half of that should be committed and never moved away from to give the steadiness to the relationship, but one half ought to be benchmarked against progress on the key issues of concern to the United States: terror, the border with Afghanistan, nuclear proliferation, Pakistani domestic reform. And we argued, finally, that the weight of American assistance should be directed as well in the fields of, principally in the fields of education and health, in the building of civil society that would give Pakistan a real opportunity to achieve a stable society, a stable political society in the decades ahead. When we stood back for a second and looked at the course of events in Afghanistan, each of us who helped prepare the report that you have concluded that the time had come to look very hard once again at United States commitments to Karzai and his regime, to the building of a central government for Afghanistan, the building of the institutions of a state that had been devastated by years of Taliban control, by a civil war that preceded it, by the record of Soviet occupation, a state whose rather fragile institutions going into the 1980s had been literally wiped away, and to have to rebuild an army, a police force, a bureaucracy, all enormous and daunting challenges in a land with a very weak tradition of governance, education, and anything approaching a civil society. This job, we understood right away, was going to take a lot longer than most Americans had come to realize, and that the level of insecurity in the country would continue to daunt us as we moved ahead. But that insecurity, despite American preoccupations in Iraq, had to be dealt with. It could only be dealt with the strengthening, with the recruitment and training of an Afghan army and police force, but the continued presence of the United States and other coalition military forces to face the dissidence that exists inside of Afghanistan, and to restart the economy as even at the minimal basis that the Afghan economy has ever known, to be able to re-begin essential agriculture, trade, recommence the infrastructure of roads and communications. All of that lay as a challenge to the United States, and at the same time to face the fact that Afghanistan had and would again and is now becoming a huge source of narcotics, one of the larger producers of narcotics that feeds the South Asian and international system. Today, I regretfully report to you, Afghanistan's opium production represents about 40% of its gross domestic product and 70% of the trade in the world. And all of this set in the fact that Afghanistan has yet to achieve legitimacy in our own region, to find stability in our relationships with Russia and the Central Asians to the north, to the Iranians, and to Pakistan in the south, and the United States' job of trying to forge a stable environment for Afghanistan represents another feature that we concluded had to be attended to. In December 2003, Nicholas Platt and I and a small group took these conclusions and we traveled, took them to Afghanistan, to Pakistan and India. We met with the governments in each case. We sat with intellectuals, media representatives. We talked through our conclusions. We accepted a debate over our findings to test whether the conclusions that I've just outlined for you and are contained in the report before you would stand up in local eyes, and whether we had in fact identified the benchmarks of American policy in the years ahead. As a general matter, I think that proved to be the case. We'd done our work, and we were satisfied with it. But perhaps most of all, we came back with a renewed sense of deep preoccupation over what we discovered to be the situation in Afghanistan. For there, ladies and gentlemen, I would argue today the United States stands literally on the edge as to whether Afghanistan can emerge from the nightmare of the past and make its way back into the community of nations with some stability, depriving itself, being deprived, no longer being a source of terror or a location or a nest for Al-Qaeda type terror in the future, no longer a place from which the most militant and radical forms of Islam would spread. We are on the edge, and the edge is not yet decided. It's not clear if Afghanistan will emerge from this terrible period fully and completely in a manner that is important to the United States. There has been indisputably some important progress, most of all political progress, for Afghans have just come together to produce a constitution that came out of the deliberations of the country's many ethnic communities, a constitution that offers a way forward politically, which Afghans can settle their quarrels at the ballot box and not on the battlefield, a way particularly to bring the disaffected majority Pashtun community of the center and southern parts of the country, the community that had traditionally ruled Afghanistan, the community that felt itself most defeated with the destruction of the Taliban, the community that once again had to be comfortable with the future of Afghanistan. This political process offers fundamentally a way forward to bring Pashtuns back into full engagement inside of Afghanistan. We came back convinced that fundamentally Afghanistan was on the right course, that the warlords had seen their day in court and had concluded the time was right to compromise with the central government, that a mixture of central government suasion, cash, American influence, and the expansion of Afghan army and administrative services were beginning to make gains and reclaim those who were living outside the government system. But that said, we had to also recognize that there was huge instability across the full the majority of the southern part of the country, that which borders on Pakistan, the instability stemming from the continued insurgency, the infiltration along an extremely complicated ethnic and political border. Border, to all of you who know Afghanistan, recognize is a misnomer. There is no border. There never has been a border. There is instead a mountain fastness with no discernible features that define a border, of which across tribal populations, Pashtun in ethnicity, 2/3 living in Pakistan, 1/3 living in Afghanistan, have moved freely over the years, and of which there is literally no control, fueled by some 2 million refugees who have not yet returned to Afghanistan, but occasionally go back to Afghanistan and return to Pakistan. A real difficult situation for any military commander trying to make sense of who's going, who's coming, and who's a danger and who is not. The Pakistan factor nonetheless looms large in the insecurity of southern Afghanistan, for there are too many sightings of the leadership of the Taliban and occasionally al-Qaeda remnants inside of Pakistan cities to give us any cause for comfort. The Pakistan government must be serious, and as you've seen from your morning's newspaper, there is a chance that with the fresh deployments of Pakistani forces, close coordination between the United States and Pakistan, that Musharraf is trying to bring control to an area that no administrative element, including the British Empire in its day, had ever brought under control in the past. Not easy, but underscoring also how long the road ahead is in Afghanistan before the very basic elements of security can be achieved. I think we came back as well worried by the willingness of our NATO allies to join the United States and give real muscle, put real muscle behind the coalition and the obligations of disarmament, the obligations of provincial security teams, all of which are necessary for the success of the progress of stability in Afghanistan. Nick Platt and I, in fact, went to Brussels and spoke to all of the ambassadors there about the demands of Afghanistan, the need for governments to come forward with real men and resources. And this, too, is a work in progress, not one that is settled. And we reflected as well, while we were in Afghanistan, on the situation that we saw before us in the drug front and the lack of a consensus among the United States, the Afghan government, the other allies in the coalition on what to do about the drug problem. It clearly cannot be dealt with by stamping out the drug production that's undertaken by Afghan farmers. It seemed to us that the best way to proceed would be to identify, as one would in any good criminal investigation, the networks, the rings, the drug lords, the traders, and go after them, rather than try to deal with the ordinary farmer. But the drug problem in Afghanistan has grown, and as the finance minister of Afghanistan put it to us, if we fail, the next finance minister will be the representative of a drug cartel, not someone like himself. The road, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, let me underscore, is long, and we are on the edge. There is no easy comfort to be drawn about the situation in Afghanistan. The positive is real, but the negatives are too, and we have to remain attentive and engaged. Happily, our report was not quite as dramatic when we reached Pakistan and India, where we found the mood substantially different, one that produced the negotiating environment that we currently are observing today. It was a real pleasure to find in both Islamabad and in New Delhi an anticipation of what could be achieved through negotiations and the broad base of public support for a new look at the way Pakistan and India are to deal with each other in the future. I would argue to each and every one of you, one of the more promising developments in the world today, and a development in which the United States has played a key role. I think as we reflect on Pakistan and India, remembering how recent and dramatic the dangers were that we faced even through 2002, we have to ask ourselves, with a history of 50 years of conflict between Pakistan and India, is this sustainable? Is this present mood of engagement a sustainable fact? And I'm going to argue with you that it is. It has the promise of being sustainable. It starts with a recognition on the part of the leadership in India and in Pakistan that the past has not worked. Freezing Pakistan out or using terror to bash down India's doors have failed as policies to change the behavior of the other party. It's also true, and very importantly true, and for the first time true, that the two leaders, Vajpayee in India and Musharraf in Pakistan, are both firmly in power and both represent constituencies that are fundamentally in favor of seeking peace one with the other. The two leaders are secure. They are on the same political clock, if you will. The two clocks tick together, and both have objectives. Vajpayee's to settle a score that has plagued his generation and relieve future generations of Indians from the agony of the past 50 years, and Musharraf to rebuild Pakistan, to rebuild its strength, its civil society, its economy, and give Pakistan a chance of being a successful and progressive nation that he has so frequently called for. This personal involvement is unlike anything I have seen in my years of following the diplomacy of South Asia. I've also been struck by the way the two leaders have approached this round of negotiations. Going back to April of last year when Vajpayee spoke, and from there on, the many steps that have been taken, it's been fascinating to watch the two sides approach each other quietly, outside the glare of publicity, avoiding press commentary, avoiding any option available that would wrong-foot the other side, to make certain that both were achieving win-win situations. And if you want to see a model of diplomatic drafting, the joint statement of January 6th that the two governments issued, and now most recently, the work of the two foreign secretaries, one recognizes the great care that both sides are putting into making certain they get it right this time. But it's more than just diplomacy. There is another fundamental difference between the engagement today between India and Pakistan, and that is the degree to which confidence-building measures have been mobilized, amassed, to give strength to the diplomatic thrust. What do I mean? The opening or reopening of air communications, ground-land communications, train and bus services across the border. The prospect even of a bus service for the first time in 50 years between the capital of Indian Kashmir, Srinagar, and the Pakistani center at Muzaffarabad. Ceasefires, while they've existed in the past, never have lasted as long as this one, and nor have they ever been extended to the volatile contest in the Siachen Glacier. The ceasefires are working. The commitment to see the numbers of terrorist incidents decline is palpable. There is real progress in a tangible way. Confidence is being built, in short, with real measures that give substance to the diplomacy. And therefore, I approach this present round of Indian-Pakistani negotiations with a sense of confidence that there is a prospect of success that I have not had for many, many years. I'm not going to argue with any of you that the road ahead will be an easy one, that there won't be setbacks, that there won't even be very discouraging setbacks, for the threats are many. The history that has plagued the two for nearly 50 years, 3 wars, and a great deal of violence and terror. The still continuing amount of cross-border violence, the assaults by radical Islamist groups inside of Pakistan on the leadership there, the attempts to kill Musharraf and destabilize his government, and then at heart, the very deeply held views of the two sides over the issues at hand, notably the issue of Kashmir, where Pakistan believes fundamentally she was wronged, that the very meaning of the Pakistani state was upset when Pakistan did not inherit Kashmir at the time of partition, and on the Indian side, that Kashmir is fundamentally part of the Indian Union, and any change in that circumstance would lead to the instability of the Union as a whole. But where I believe the road ahead will be tested, and where I come out, is that there are 3 overwhelming realities that both sides will have to keep in mind, and all of us, as we watch them. And that is that first and foremost, force between India and Pakistan will not alter the realities. The second great truth is that neither side can advance its interests towards a settlement if the other side is humiliated. And third, and finally, there can be no lasting, enduring progress on the issue, particularly of Kashmir, if the Kashmiris themselves are not involved, and Kashmir remains the center of the dispute. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are watching India and Pakistan engage in something that's quite unique. It's called a composite dialogue. That means that all issues outstanding, including the issue of Kashmir, is on the table. And as the foreign secretaries have just shown, it's going to take skill to address all the issues and deal with them, never allowing one issue to hold another in hostage, to allow agreements to be reached in serial form and put into effect, adding to the confidence-building measures, showing that there is a way forward. This will be tough, and the outcome is not at all certain. We can take hope from the way the Indians and Pakistanis have started. We can also take hope from the fact that at their highest levels, the Indians are now sitting down and talking with the militants in Kashmir itself, but there are many risks, and we can't underestimate a single one of them. Which leads me to my final note, and that is, what is the role of the United States and of American diplomacy? I believe, as I hope I've argued during the course of our time together, that the most vital interests of the United States are at stake in what happens in South Asia. We have our soldiers on the battlefields of Afghanistan. Afghanistan, our greatest victory in the war on terror, one we cannot afford to see compromised. A need as well for stability in Pakistan, a control of weapons of mass destruction, lest their proliferation threaten American national security directly, a need for a stable Pakistan, a need for a strong relationship with India. All of these interests bring us to involve ourselves and our diplomacy in South Asia. In this regard, I have the highest words of praise for the way the administration, the President, the Secretary of State, despite many distractions, have focused the administration's time and attention on South Asia, not seeking to grandstand or step forward, not seeking to act as a mediator, but as friends of Pakistan and India, as friends of negotiations, as facilitators, not mediators, recognizing that the United States cannot replace the imagination and political will of the parties, but it can encourage and help and nudge matters along. And therefore, the right way forward in the future is to engage, as Ed would be the first to recognize, in quiet diplomacy. Diplomacy that opens doors and unblocks perceptions, but never stands at the center of the stage. That's clearly the right way forward. Also, vital in going forward is to make certain that our relationships with Pakistan and with India are strengthened, to make certain that Pakistan receives the tangible expressions of American support that the $3 billion on the table before the Congress today calls for, the trade regimes, that the movement of our cabinet officers back and forth, our strategic understandings with the two nations are developed and deepened, that the impediments, such impediments as the high technology controls that we've known in the past, are set aside. And if we get it right with Pakistan and India, if we construct a stable relationship with both, the context of a sustained and successful American policy in South Asia lies before us. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been very patient with me, a chance to give you an account of not only our report, but our findings on the ground. It's a pleasure to bring those conclusions to Houston, and particularly to audiences of the Baker Center and the Asia Society, where you maintain such a lively interest. And if there is some time left over, and Ed, with yours and Nancy's permission, be happy to take questions. I think we... Please wait for the microphone. Let me start with the first hand I saw, the gentleman with the white collar and the blue shirt.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Question, the Pakistani intelligence services appear to still be shot through with Islamist and Taliban sympathizers, and I guess, you know, the nightmare scenario is that Musharraf gets killed and these guys get their hands on Pakistani nukes. What sort of progress is being made in Musharraf's riding the tiger?
Well, I'm going to give away a small secret. If you are patient until a bit later in the spring, I don't know how many of you remember two writers, Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins, who did Is Paris Burning? Freedom at Midnight. They're about to come out with an absolutely sensational novel, and it's precisely on this subject. And it goes right down the nightmare scenario that you described and ends in, unfortunately, in my case, New York City, with a rather dramatic outcome. I won't spoil it for you when it finally hits the book stands, but this is more than the movie rights they ought to do pretty well. First time the two of them have written anything in 25 years together, and it's kind of exciting. But it's more than just the figment of novelists' imagination. These are real worries. My own view is that ISI, the Pakistani Combined Intelligence Service, is under military control and is under Musharraf's control. That said, ISI has spawned over the years it has outsourced the job of terror, and the institutions that were set up to propagate terror and were supported by ISI are alive and well and extremely dangerous. They've grown in strength over the years, and they won't be uprooted from the Pakistani scene anytime soon. They represent a lively threat not only to Musharraf and his government, but to the situation in Afghanistan and, of course, the control of terror across the border into India. It's going to be a while before we know if they will be brought fully under control. And obviously Musharraf is being very, very careful. If you follow him these days, he barely moves outside the army compound in Rawalpindi. His sort of days of political campaigning are over until he's certain that those who are trying to kill him have been brought under control. But I say that not to make the issue dramatic, but to say that I believe all of what I've said, notwithstanding, Musharraf is in strong control of his own house, and he has been careful in the way that he has brought the most important political institution in the country, the Pakistani army, the corps commanders, the army command, along with him as he has moved since 2001 to the place he's at today, and that he represents today a consensus and not a lone figure. That consensus is even more evident when you leave the army commands and go out into Pakistani society, into the newspaper community, intellectual community, in the business community, where several years ago I would have said Pakistani businessmen were frightened of normalization with India, lest Pakistani industry be swamped with Indian exports. Today, Pakistani businessmen are stout in arguing that they can acquire the inputs they need at a much more reasonable price. They'll have much bigger markets, and that their companies are competitive enough to be able to take advantage and not suffer at the hands of a more open trade situation with India. There's a palpable mood of optimism, in fact, on both sides. And I think if something happened to Musharraf, which I would hope isn't the case, all of us would, there will be an interruption, a slowing down. But I think the majority of the momentum today is in the favor of the two sides continuing as opposed to interrupting. Yes. I think you've been asked to use it, Doctor. Good to see you again, sir.
Nice to see you. Krishna Dronam Raju. Before I mention my question, I want to state briefly, recall with great pleasure the several visits I made to the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi while you were there as ambassador. And we all appreciate your service to Indo-U.S. relations. My question really concerns not security, but economics. There seems to be a great deal of concern in the United States about outsourcing to India and China. Would you please comment on that? Is this a realistic fear or not?
Oh, I think it's very real, and I tried to mention it in my remarks, but let me come back and make a couple of points. I think that the outsourcing debate, particularly outsourcing in services, is not only serious today, it's gotten into the political campaign, it's going to be more serious in the future. If you go across the landscape of the United States today, they're with one or two, with a percentage point of error one way or the other, I'd say 75% of all state legislatures have measures to stop service outsourcing, impede it, undermine it. At the federal level, there is a couple of legislative initiatives being planned, one rather modest one that just passed. There is a real sentiment about outsourcing. And the sensitivity of service outsourcing is greater than I would have ever imagined until the other day I picked up my phone, as I suspect many of you have, and ended up with an ordinary consumer complaint. I was speaking to Bangalore, and a young lady on the other end. And I guess the difference between my conversation with her and the Ford Motor plant that closed some years before in my part of Maryland, that plant had gone and the people had found jobs, but I'll always be talking to that lady in Bangalore, always reminded that those jobs left the United States. The Communication Workers of America have been very effective in mobilizing this sentiment. I think it is profoundly wrong-headed. I believe that as the American debate continues, we will once again get it right in this country and recognize that the advantages in outsourcing hugely outweigh the disadvantages. But we're just beginning that debate, and as in most debates, the negative side, the side against outsourcing, has gotten off to the early start, and only recently the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, and others have begun to gear up to put the counter-arguments forward. The counter-arguments are very clear. When a corporation saves money, it can invest that money in new technologies. It can reward its investors as they should be rewarded if new capital is to flow. Shareholders can be satisfied. For all these reasons, we welcome it when companies cut costs. And I believe sufficiently in the American capacity to innovate and produce new technologies and new methods, new systems of production, that by reducing the costs of our existing corporations, we're adding to our future potential, not taking away from it. But I recognize at the same time, as I suspect everyone in this room does, that the political debate will be settled in the short run, and therefore we need very good arguments. And I argued with you this morning that I would approach India with a view to opening the service market. The more outsourcing that makes economic sense, the better. But in return, India needs to open her market. Today, Doctor, you know well as anyone, an American lawyer cannot go and work in any manner in India. An accountant can't work. The financial service industry is still mostly closed to American or foreign interventions. My own industry, the insurance industry, we are allowed to own no more than 26% of the businesses we engage in. These constraints on our ability to take advantage of the Indian marketplace, while at the same time India calls for our markets to be open, strike me as unwise and palpably unfair. India has a huge opportunity before her in the world of service outsourcing. 50% of all outsourcing done in the world today is done in India. Others are coming along. The Philippines, China, even in our own hemisphere. But India, with her huge human resource potential, has paced this race and stands to profit from it greatly. And therefore, flexibility on the Indian side to meet us in a bargain strikes me as making a great deal of sense. Yes, sir, right here, and yes.
Mr. Ambassador, the United States seeks to promote democracy throughout the Muslim world. We also hope to engage moderate Islamic governments in these countries. Are those two goals incompatible in Pakistan, for example?
They're not incompatible in the long run. They're hard to achieve in the short run, and they cannot be achieved by force and external pressure, not in Pakistan, not in the Middle East. They can be achieved by the quiet and patient exercise of influence, taking advantage of the sentiment in societies throughout the Muslim world for democratic expansion. But if it's ever seen to be an export item from the United States, exported on the tip of a bayonet, it won't work. It takes very careful and quiet persuasion. I think it's possible. Pakistan has strong origins of democratic experience. It's important that our policies be directed towards Musharraf to encourage him to move down this road. And yes, of course, with democracy comes the hyperbole, the exaggerations, the ability of radical elements to take advantage of undereducated populations. All those risks are there. It's gone about carefully. If the institutions of democracy are built, courts and free presses, expanded educational opportunity, in the long run, I think we can get it right. But we have to be careful we're not seen to be democracy's bullies as opposed to its propagators.
Quick question.
Yes.
Thank you very
Françoise, of course.
But don't you think that our foreign service is not really very well equipped at the moment for this quiet diplomacy, and that we are neglecting a lot of things because we don't have the historic background and we don't even have the expertise right now?
I fear to an important degree you're right, but I hearken to all of you. I know that Françoise has it in her mind, the extraordinary work that Ed Derigan and those who joined you, Ed, in producing a fresh look at public diplomacy, America's opportunities and obligations if we're to make a success of our foreign policy. To produce, among many of your other conclusions that are well-founded, a cadre of young men and women who are trained in languages, who are sensitive to local conditions, who are advocates in a sensitive manner of American values, and yet can reflect back here the danger points if one's to avoid crashing on the shoals that you rightly, gentlemen, blue jacket, referred to. I think we have a big job of rebuilding our external capacities, and it's going to take a long time. Happily, the good news for all of us is the unprecedented numbers of young Americans who are flocking back to area studies, who want to engage in tough languages, Arabic, Urdu, Persian, where this interest had not existed in the past couple of decades. Those who are keen to get back into government public service, the recruitment of our foreign service, of the CIA, is changed in complexion. The raw material is there, well-educated, thoughtful Americans, but we have to figure out as a polity how we fund it and make it possible for this enthusiasm, well-founded and needed, to actually be effective. Yes, sir. Wow.
It seems that during your visits to India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, meeting all those leaders and the intelligentsia, is there any chance between those three countries recognition that they have to all get together to overcome the terrorism and all other problems and bring about the democracy in that part of the world?
I wouldn't want to go so far now. I think there is a sharp recognition in Afghanistan that Afghanistan, despite its historic quarrels with Pakistan, cannot survive without Pakistan. There is a palpable recognition in Pakistan that unless Pakistan works for peace and stability with Afghanistan and with India, Pakistan will be isolated internationally and will make a number of the wrong choices that Pakistan has made in the past, in the nuclear field, in supporting the Taliban and backing violence in India. But that if Pakistan wants to progress, it has to start with a very constructive view towards its neighborhood. That's recognized, but the rivalries, the sense of the palpable sense of history is still very, very quick and apparent. On India's side, India really sends the signal that she wants to get into the world and be a major global player. It's quite terrific today to be in India, coming back to the question on outsourcing, to have the Indian foreign minister lecture us on the need to sensitize Americans to the advantage of globalization. When for years I have been faced with, the highest tariff barriers that existed on the globe. Nonetheless, India recognizes without a settlement with Pakistan, she's dragging a ball and chain as a convict would around and can't move herself and her population forward. But I was really struck by Indians of older than myself, the Prime Minister's generation, who remember the pain of partition, have seen over the past 50 years what violence has done, of how the two nations have lost competitive ground in the world, how the populations of South Asia have ended up less well-educated, less healthy, less productive because of their rivalries. And a real sense in the Prime Minister Vajpayee's behalf that he does not want this situation to be perpetuated. He believes his generation bears a responsibility to end the quarrel. But does that mean you move from even an attempt to end the most dangerous forms of the quarrel to the scope of cooperation that you have in mind? I don't think so, not yet. We still have too far to go to rebuild confidence.
We have time for one more question.
Well, this is hard to, you've been the most patient, sorry. Good.
Thank you. Coming back to Houston, thank you very much. I have a very simple question. In your algebraic relationship with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, don't you think we're missing on the other side of the equation, the China factor? I think it's a very, very important because, as you know, although we generically we say Kashmir, it's Kashmir and Jammu, and part of Jammu has been traded to China by Pakistan. So it's a third very important element that has to be considered. What's your take on that?
Yes. Well, I think it's a very good point. And Ed Derigan, if you and Nancy will have me back again this spring, former ambassador to China, Winston Lord, and I are coming out with a book on India and China, for we believe it is one of the most important relationships in the world, and there exists today not a single work on the subject. And we've actually managed to bring together a group of the best China scholars in the United States and the best India scholars, and they've done a joint draft to be published by the Woodrow Wilson Center, and will provide all the details that I can't in a couple of seconds. Let me just make a couple of overall observations. First, the India-China equation is extraordinarily important. And it will not be an easy equation. It has seen violence and war. It has also seen attempts by both governments to find stability. Today, the dominant spirit of the relationship is to find accommodation. The recent visit of the Indian National Security Advisor to Beijing, following on Atal Bihari Vajpayee's week-long stay in China last June, the way the Chinese have responded point to the fact that the two sides are looking for equilibrium and balance. That doesn't mean that there won't be a sense of commercial and economic rivalry, and even a sense of rivalry for influence in Southeast Asia and other areas of importance to the two countries. But I suspect, as present circumstances would have it, the two sides seek restraint. They seek even cooperation. And I would argue that the two sides, that is Beijing and New Delhi, also believe their most important external relationship is with Washington, not with each other. And therefore, we as Americans have a capacity to make certain that this relationship remains peaceful and non-contentious, as long as we understand what our responsibilities are and don't try to assume that we can wrong foot one or the other of Asia's two great nations by pitting one against the other. There's no health in that. We can be a force for stability. We have the influence to do it. It's in our interest to play that out. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your attention. And welcome today. Appreciate it.